In this video, we're going to explore how we can interpret the results of a medical test. And we're going to apply this to the example of COVID-19. Now, let's suppose that 5% of the population is infected with the virus, but there is a test for the virus which is available over the counter in a pharmacist, which is called the lateral flow test. However, the lateral flow test is not perfect. Sometimes it will report that individuals don't have the virus when they actually do, and sometimes it will report that the individuals do have the virus when they actually don't. So the probability of a false positive, that's recording a positive test when an individual doesn't have the virus, is 0.004. Now this 0.004 is a conditional probability. This is the probability that the test is positive given that the individual does not have COVID. And similarly, the probability of a false negative, that's the probability of an individual who is infected getting a negative test, is 0.4. So the probability that the test is negative, conditional on the individual having COVID, is equal to 0.4. Now this might be easier to interpret visually. So let's try and represent the population and the results of COVID tests. Now this rectangle is going to represent the entire population, and some of those individuals have COVID and some of them don't. So let's split this population up into the individuals who have COVID and the individuals who don't, and let's have the yellow area representing those who have COVID and the green area represent those who do not. Now obviously this isn't drawn to scale. Now, amongst those who are suffering from COVID, some will experience a negative test. So let's indicate them with the purple area. And similarly, some of those who don't suffer from COVID will experience a positive test. So let's label each of these areas. So we can see that we get positive tests sometimes when the individual has COVID and sometimes when the individual doesn't have COVID. And the question is, if we observe a positive test, what is the probability that the individual actually has COVID? So how would we go about calculating this? Well, remember, we know some information. We know the probability that COVID is equal to yes. That is, the individual is infected with COVID is 5% or 0.05. We also know the probability of a false positive. That is the probability that the test is positive, conditional on an individual not having COVID, is equal to 0.004. And similarly, we know the probability of a false negative, so the probability that the test is negative given that an individual has COVID, which is equal to 0.4. Now, from this second probability that we've got here, this second conditional probability, we can write down the probability of a positive test if an individual has COVID, because there are only two possibilities for the test, positive or negative. So from this, the probability that the test is positive, given that the individual has COVID, is going to be equal to 1 minus 0.4, which is equal to 0.6. Now, from this, we can calculate the size of these two areas. We can calculate these sizes to help us to understand the probability that the individual has COVID, given that we observe a positive test. So we know that this total area, the area for individuals who have COVID makes up 5% of the population. And we also know that of that 5%, 60% would experience a positive COVID test. So we can say that the proportion of the population who get a positive test and have COVID is going to be equal to 60% of that 5%. So the probability of COVID being yes and the test being positive is going to be equal to the probability that the individual has COVID times by the conditional probability of a positive test given that the individual has COVID. So just to repeat, this area is made up of 5% of the population. We know that of that 5%, 60% get a positive test. So 60% of that 5% get a positive test and have COVID. So we can write that this is equal to 0.05 times by 0.6, which is going to be equal to 0.03. So this area that we've just drawn up here is going to be equal to 3% of the population, or occurs with a probability 0.03. Similarly, we can find the probability that an individual doesn't have COVID and gets a positive test using a very similar calculation. So the probability that COVID is no and the test is positive that is going to be the size of this red area in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, again, we know that 95% of the population don't have COVID, and of that 95%, 0.004 or 0.4% get a positive test. So using exactly the same rule as we did before, the probability of an individual not having COVID and having a positive test is going to be equal to the probability that the individual doesn't have COVID times by the probability that they have a positive test given that they don't have COVID. And we know these probabilities, and this is just going to be equal to 0.95 times by 0.004, which gives us a probability equal to 0.0038. So in other words, this area is going to be equal to 0.38% of the population, or occurs with a probability 0.0038. So from the information that we've generated, we can write down a number of other things. We can write down the probability of a positive test. The probability of positive test is going to be equal to this area where an individual has a positive test and has COVID, plus this area where an individual has a positive test but doesn't have COVID. So the probability of a positive test is going to be equal to the probability that the individual has COVID and gets a positive test, plus the probability that an individual doesn't have COVID and they get a positive test. So this total area is going to be equal to 0.03 plus 0.0038, which is equal to 0.0338. Now, the final thing to do is we want to know what proportion of those individuals who have a positive test are suffering from COVID. So we want to know, conditional on a positive test, what is the probability that an individual has COVID? So the probability that an individual has COVID, conditional on the test being positive, Well, we want to know what proportion of the 3.38% of individuals have COVID amongst those who test positive. But we know that 3% of the population have COVID and get a positive test, and we know that 3.38% of the population get a positive test, so we can find that fraction. We're going to find 0.03 divided by 0.0338, and that will give us the proportion of those individuals who have a positive test who are suffering from COVID, which gives us a probability of 0.88757, or 88.76% of individuals who get a positive test are suffering from COVID. So in this video, intuitively, we've developed what is known as Bayes' rule. And Bayes' rule is a really important rule for enabling us to make conclusions about individuals based on their observed characteristics. So in the example that we've just seen, the probability that an individual has COVID, given that we see a positive test, is just equal to the probability that the individual has COVID times by the conditional probability that the test is positive, given that the individual is suffering from COVID, divided through by the probability that the test was positive.